Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was terribly wrong, but everyone around you thought you were crazy? Where speaking up could cost you everything, but staying silent could cost someone their life? That's exactly where I found myself on a cold November morning, standing in front of an open casket, my hand pressed against expensive mahogany wood, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest, and everyone in that room staring at me like I had completely lost my mind. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm about to tell you the most terrifying, unbelievable story of my life, a story about power, deception, and the moment I had to choose between my own safety and doing what was right. This is the true story of how I, a simple cook, stopped a billionaire's funeral and uncovered a conspiracy that would shake an entire empire to its core. Let me take you back to where it all began, 18 months before that fateful day, when I was just trying to survive and had no idea I was about to enter a world of luxury, lies, and deadly secrets. I remember the exact moment I walked through those towering iron gates for the first time, my worn sneakers crunching on the pristine gravel driveway, my eyes wide as I took in the sprawling mansion that would become both my workplace and the setting for the most harrowing experience of my life. I had been working 3 jobs just to keep my head above water after my mother's medical bills had drained every penny I had saved. I was exhausted, desperate. And when I saw the job posting for a private cook position at the Reynolds estate, offering a salary that seemed almost too good to be true, I knew I had to take the chance. The interview process had been intense. Background checks, reference verifications, even a psychological evaluation, which seemed excessive for a cooking position. But I was in no position to question it. When I finally received the call that I had been selected, I felt like I had won the lottery. Little did I know that I was stepping into something far more complex and dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Marcus Reynolds was not just wealthy. He was powerful in ways that most people couldn't even comprehend. At 73 years old, he had built an empire that spanned real estate, technology, and pharmaceutical industries. His net worth was estimated at over $12 billion, and his influence reached into the highest levels of government and business. But when I first met him, I didn't see a ruthless tycoon or a business mogul. I saw a tired old man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, someone who seemed genuinely interested in the simple pleasure of a well-cooked meal. He would often come into the kitchen while I was preparing dinner, leaning against the counter and telling me stories about his childhood, about building his first company from nothing, about the wife he had lost to cancer 15 years ago, and how he still missed her every single day. Those moments felt real, authentic, and I found myself caring about this man who seemed so lonely despite all his wealth and power. He told me once that good food was one of the few genuine pleasures he had left in life, and that my cooking reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen in rural Pennsylvania, where he had grown up with nothing but love and homemade bread. I felt proud of my work, proud that I could bring some comfort to this man who seemed to have everything except true companionship and peace. But the mansion itself was a different story altogether. It was a place of cold marble floors, towering ceilings, and rooms so large they seemed to swallow sound itself. The staff rarely spoke to each other beyond what was professionally necessary, and there was an atmosphere of constant surveillance that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. I would catch glimpses of security cameras in every corner, notice how conversations would stop abruptly when I entered a room, feel eyes watching me even when I thought I was alone. The other staff members, the housekeepers, the security guards, the personal assistants, they all seemed to operate under an unspoken code of silence. When I tried to be friendly, to build the kind of camaraderie I had experienced in other jobs, I was met with polite but distant responses. It was as if everyone was afraid of something, or someone, but no one would say what. I remember thinking how strange it was that a place filled with so many people could feel so isolating, so lonely. At night, lying in my small room in the staff quarters, I would hear footsteps in hallways that should have been empty, voices speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors, and sometimes when I couldn't sleep, I would stand at my window and watch dark cars come and go at odd hours, carrying people whose faces I never quite saw clearly. The first time I met Victoria Reynolds, Marcus's daughter, I understood immediately why the atmosphere in the house was so tense. She swept into the kitchen one afternoon like a storm, her designer heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, her perfectly styled blonde hair not moving despite her quick movements, her cold blue eyes assessing me with the kind of calculation usually reserved for business negotiations. She was 47 years old, but looked at least a decade younger, thanks to what I assumed were expensive treatments and procedures. Everything about her screamed control, from her tailored Chanel suit to the way she held her phone like it was a weapon she might deploy at any moment. She barely acknowledged my greeting, instead going straight to criticism of the meal I had prepared for her father the night before, saying it was too heavy, too rich, that I clearly didn't understand the dietary needs of an elderly man. Her tone was dismissive, almost cruel, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. But what struck me most was the way she looked around the kitchen, as if she was taking inventory of every pot, every ingredient, every movement I made. It wasn't the concern of a daughter worried about her father's health. It was something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As she left, she turned back and said something that would echo in my mind for months to come. "Remember, Miss Chen, my father's health and well-being are the most important things in this house. I trust you understand the gravity of your responsibility here." The way she emphasized those words, the weight she put on them, made it clear this wasn't just about cooking good meals. Over the following months, I began to notice patterns that didn't quite add up. Marcus had a personal physician, Dr. Harrison Webb, who visited the estate 3 times a week, far more frequently than seemed necessary for routine checkups. I would see him arrive with his black medical bag, spend an hour or two with Marcus in the study, and then leave with that same bag looking somehow heavier. Marcus began to change, slowly at first, then more rapidly. The energetic man who used to come to my kitchen to chat became increasingly tired, forgetful, withdrawn. His hands would shake when he tried to hold his fork, and sometimes he would stare at his plate as if he couldn't remember what food was for. I tried to adjust his meals, making them more nutritious, easier to digest, but nothing seemed to help. When I expressed my concerns to Victoria, suggesting perhaps Marcus should see a specialist, she smiled at me with all the warmth of a snake and said her father was receiving the best possible care, that I should focus on my job and leave medical matters to the professionals. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I started paying closer attention to everything: the medications that were delivered to the house in unmarked packages, the private conversations between Victoria and Dr. Webb that would stop abruptly when anyone came near, the way Marcus's lucidity seemed to fluctuate in patterns that didn't match any illness I had ever heard of. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something terrible is happening right in front of you, but you can't quite prove it? That's where I was, caught between my instincts screaming that Marcus was in danger, and the rational part of my brain telling me I was just a cook who was reading too much into things I didn't understand. Things escalated dramatically about 6 months into my employment. I was preparing Marcus's breakfast one morning, a simple meal of oatmeal with fresh berries, whole grain toast, and green tea, when Victoria entered the kitchen with Dr. Webb. They didn't notice me at first because I was in the pantry gathering ingredients, and I heard Victoria say something that made my blood run cold. "How much longer do we need to continue this charade? The treatments are taking too long, and I need to move forward with the restructuring plans. Can't you increase the dosage?" Dr. Webb's response was muffled, but I caught the words careful and suspicion and autopsy. I stood frozen in the pantry, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to process what I had just heard. Were they talking about Marcus? Were they making him sick intentionally? My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the container of oats I was holding. When I finally emerged from the pantry, trying to act natural, Victoria's eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me feel like she could see straight into my soul, could read every thought in my head. She asked how long I had been in the pantry, her voice casual but her eyes sharp and dangerous. I stammered something about organizing supplies, and she smiled that cold smile again before she and Dr. Webb left the kitchen. I couldn't focus for the rest of that day, my mind racing with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was I in danger now that I had overheard their conversation? Should I go to the police? But with what evidence? A snippet of conversation that could be interpreted a dozen different ways? Who would believe a cook over a billionaire's daughter and a respected physician? I became hyper-vigilant after that incident, documenting everything I could in a small notebook I kept hidden in my room. I noted every medication delivery, every visit from Dr. Webb, every change in Marcus's condition. I started taking photos of pill bottles when I could, researching the medications online late at night. What I discovered was horrifying. Many of the drugs Marcus was being given were known to cause cognitive decline, memory loss, and physical weakness when combined in certain ways. They weren't treating him. They were slowly poisoning him, creating the appearance of natural decline in an elderly man. But I still didn't have solid proof, nothing that would convince the authorities or anyone else that what I suspected was actually happening. Marcus became so weak that he could barely leave his bedroom. The vibrant man I had first met was now a shadow, confused and frail, sometimes not even recognizing me when I brought him his meals. It broke my heart to see him like this, to know that I was probably right about what was being done to him, but to feel so powerless to stop it. I tried to talk to other staff members to see if anyone else had noticed the strange patterns, but they either genuinely didn't see what I saw or were too afraid to acknowledge it. The head of security, a man named Robert Chen, no relation to me despite the shared last name, actually pulled me aside one day and warned me in the kindest way possible that asking too many questions about the Reynolds family's private matters was not healthy for my continued employment or my general well-being. The implication was clear: stay quiet or face consequences. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in November, unseasonably cold with frost covering the mansion's extensive gardens, when I arrived at the kitchen to start preparing breakfast and found the entire household in chaos. Staff members were rushing around with tear-stained faces, security was doubled at all entrances, and Victoria was on the phone in the main hall, her voice artificially grief-stricken as she made what sounded like arrangements. My heart sank. I grabbed one of the housekeepers, a young woman named Maria who had always been kind to me, and asked what had happened. With tears streaming down her face, she told me that Marcus had passed away during the night, peacefully in his sleep according to Dr. Webb, and that funeral arrangements were already being made. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The shock, the grief, the anger, they all hit me at once, but underneath all of that was something else. Deep, unshakable suspicion. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed with Victoria's impatience that I had overheard weeks ago. I asked Maria if there would be an autopsy, and she looked at me strangely, saying that Dr. Webb had already signed the death certificate citing natural causes related to age and declining health, so there was no need for an autopsy. Of course there wasn't. They had covered every base, anticipated every question. I went through the motions of my duties that day, preparing food for the flood of business associates and distant family members who began arriving at the estate, but my mind was elsewhere, trying to figure out what, if anything, I could do. The funeral was scheduled for 3 days later, an unusually quick timeline that Victoria explained away as following Marcus's wishes for a simple, expedient service. Those 3 days were a blur of activity, with funeral planners transforming the mansion's grand ballroom into a memorial space, with florists bringing in thousands of white lilies and roses, with caterers and staff preparing for hundreds of guests. I was expected to help coordinate the post-funeral reception, which meant I had legitimate reasons to be present throughout the service. The morning of the funeral arrived with that same bitter cold, and I dressed in the simple black dress that was standard for staff attending formal estate events. Guests began arriving early: politicians, business tycoons, celebrities, all coming to pay their respects to Marcus Reynolds, or more likely, to be seen paying their respects. The atmosphere was one of formal solemnity, but I noticed how many conversations seemed to be about business deals and networking rather than genuine grief for a man who had just died. Victoria played her part perfectly, the grieving daughter in elegant black Dior, accepting condolences with just the right amount of composed sadness. I stood in the back of the ballroom as the service began, watching the closed casket at the front, listening to the minister speak about Marcus's life and legacy, and feeling increasingly agitated. Something was very wrong. I could feel it in every fiber of my being, but I couldn't articulate what it was. Then, during a moment of silence, I heard something that made my entire body go rigid. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the ambient sounds of breathing and shifting in seats, but I heard it. A rhythmic thumping, steady and persistent, coming from the direction of the casket. My rational mind tried to dismiss it as imagination, as grief playing tricks on my senses, but the sound persisted, and I knew with absolute certainty what I was hearing. It was a heartbeat. Marcus's heartbeat. He wasn't dead. He was in that casket, alive but probably heavily sedated, and they were going to bury him. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the back of a chair to keep from falling. What should I do? If I was wrong, I would be fired, probably arrested for disturbing a funeral, and my credibility would be destroyed. But if I was right and I did nothing, Marcus would be buried alive, would die a horrific death, and I would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. The minister continued speaking, words about dust and ashes, about eternal rest, and all I could hear was that heartbeat, growing louder in my ears, pounding in synchronization with my own racing pulse. People around me were crying quietly, heads bowed in prayer, completely unaware of the horror that was unfolding right in front of them. I looked at Victoria in the front row, and I swear I saw the smallest hint of a smile on her perfectly made-up face, a look of satisfaction that made my decision for me. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't be complicit in murder through my silence. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I pushed through the crowd. Excuse me? Excuse me? Pardon me? People looking at me with confusion and irritation as I made my way toward the front of the room. The gasp started when I reached the casket, when I placed both hands on the polished wood and announced in a voice that I was shocked to find steady and clear, "Stop this funeral. Marcus Reynolds is not dead. There's a heartbeat. He's alive in there." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and that persistent, life-affirming heartbeat that only I seemed to hear. Victoria shot to her feet, her face transforming from composed grief to cold fury in an instant. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "How dare you disrupt my father's funeral with these insane accusations? Someone remove this woman immediately." Security guards started moving toward me, and I knew I had seconds to make my case. "Please," I said, louder this time, addressing the entire room of shocked, silent guests. "I've been Marcus's cook for 18 months. I've watched him decline unnaturally quickly. I've overheard conversations about treatments and dosages. Please, just open the casket. If I'm wrong, I'll accept any consequences. But if I'm right, we're about to bury a living man." Dr. Webb stood up, his face red with indignation, launching into a professional explanation about death processes and how grief can make people hear things that aren't there, about how my accusations were not only false, but deeply offensive to the family. But I stood my ground, my hand still on the casket, feeling through the wood what I knew in my soul was a human heartbeat. Some of the guests were murmuring now, uncertainty spreading through the room, and I saw a few people who I recognized as Marcus's actual friends, not just business associates, looking troubled, exchanging glances. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly man in the third row stood up, and I recognized him as Judge William Morrison, one of Marcus's oldest friends, someone who had been mentioned in the stories Marcus used to tell me in the kitchen. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned over decades on the bench, "I think we should honor this young woman's request. If she's wrong, we can proceed with the service after a brief delay. But if there's even the smallest possibility that she's right, we have a moral and legal obligation to verify your father's condition." Victoria's composure cracked completely, her voice rising to a near shriek as she insisted this was outrageous, that I was clearly mentally unstable, that opening the casket was a desecration that her father would never have wanted. But Judge Morrison stood firm, and I saw other people nodding in agreement, the tide of opinion shifting. More security arrived, but they seemed uncertain about who to follow: Victoria's orders to remove me, or the judge's insistence that the casket be opened. The standoff felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only minutes, every second stretching out in agonizing slow motion. Finally, the funeral director, looking extremely uncomfortable and probably worried about lawsuits from every direction, made the executive decision to open the casket. Have you ever experienced a moment where time seems to stop, where everything hinges on a single action, where the entire trajectory of multiple lives is about to change irrevocably? That's where I was, watching as the funeral director's hands moved to the casket seals, my heart in my throat, praying that I was right, terrified that I might be wrong. The casket opened, and the collective gasp that went through the room confirmed what I had known in my bones. Marcus Reynolds lay inside, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, his skin pale but warm, his eyelids fluttering as if he was trying to wake from a deep sleep. He was alive. Several people started shouting at once, pulling out phones to call 911, demanding explanations, some crying, others backing away in horror. I felt my legs give out, and I collapsed against the casket, relief and shock overwhelming me in equal measure. I had been right. I had actually been right, and I had just saved Marcus's life. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Later, I learned that someone had already called them when I first made my accusation, just in case. They quickly assessed Marcus, confirming he was alive but heavily sedated, and began emergency treatment right there in the ballroom before transporting him to the hospital. The scene devolved into absolute chaos. Police arrived, and Victoria was immediately the center of attention, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered as she screamed about lawsuits and false accusations and how this was all a misunderstanding. Dr. Webb tried to leave through a side exit but was stopped by security, the same security that had been ready to remove me minutes before. Judge Morrison took charge of the situation with the natural authority of someone used to courtrooms in crisis, ensuring that evidence was preserved and that no one left the premises until police could take statements. I spent the next 6 hours being interviewed by detectives, going through everything I had observed over the past 18 months, showing them my notebook with its careful documentation, providing them with photos I had taken of medication bottles. At first, they were skeptical. I could see it in their eyes, the assumption that I was some disgruntled employee making wild accusations. But as they interviewed other staff members who, freed from the atmosphere of fear that had pervaded the estate, began sharing their own suspicions and observations, the picture became clearer. They obtained warrants and searched Victoria's private office, Dr. Webb's medical files, and bank records. What they uncovered was more extensive and sinister than even I had imagined. Victoria and Dr. Webb had been slowly poisoning Marcus for over a year, using a combination of medications that mimicked natural cognitive decline and physical weakness. The plan was to have him declared incompetent, transfer his assets to her control, and then, when the time was right, to increase the dosages until his death could be written off as the natural progression of his illness. But Marcus, despite being weakened and confused, had been more resilient than they anticipated, so they had decided to expedite the timeline. The funeral was meant to be the final act. Marcus would be heavily sedated but alive when placed in the casket, and he would die of suffocation while buried, with no one the wiser because the death certificate had already been signed. It was murder disguised as natural death, and it was motivated by the one thing that drives so much evil in this world: money. Victoria stood to inherit billions, but only if Marcus died before he could change his will, which, according to documents found in his attorney's office, he had recently expressed interest in doing. The trial was a media sensation that dominated headlines for months. Victoria Reynolds and Dr. Harrison Webb were both charged with attempted murder, fraud, and a host of other crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing payments from Victoria to Dr. Webb totaling millions of dollars, text messages between them discussing dosages and timelines, testimony from staff members and pharmaceutical suppliers, and most damningly, the toxicology reports from Marcus's blood when he arrived at the hospital, showing dangerous levels of sedatives and other drugs that had no legitimate medical purpose for his actual conditions. I had to testify, which was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, sitting in that witness stand with Victoria staring at me with pure hatred in her eyes, her expensive legal team trying to paint me as an unreliable witness with ulterior motives. But the facts spoke for themselves, and in the end, Victoria was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Dr. Webb received 20 years, his medical license permanently revoked. Other conspirators, including a few staff members who had been complicit in smaller ways, received lesser sentences. Throughout the trial, Marcus was recovering in a private medical facility, undergoing treatment to reverse the damage done by months of poisoning. His recovery was slow but steady, and the doctors said it was miraculous that he survived at all, let alone with most of his cognitive functions intact. The first time I visited him in the hospital, about 2 months after the funeral that never was, he took my hand in his trembling one and said, "Sarah, you gave me back my life. How does one even begin to thank someone for that?" I couldn't answer because I was crying too hard, overwhelmed by everything that had happened, by how close we had come to a very different outcome. Marcus's recovery took almost a year, but eventually he was well enough to return home, though not to the mansion, which he sold along with most of his material possessions. He told me that his brush with death had given him perspective on what truly mattered, and it wasn't expensive cars or sprawling estates or business empires. He set up a foundation dedicated to elder abuse prevention and moved into a modest home in Vermont, near the town where he had grown up. He asked me to come with him, not as a cook but as a companion, someone he trusted and considered family. I accepted, and for the next 3 years I had the privilege of truly getting to know Marcus Reynolds, not the tycoon, but the man. We would cook together in his small kitchen, take walks through the Vermont woods, and sit by the fireplace while he shared stories of his life, the mistakes he had made, the regrets he carried, and the gratitude he felt for a second chance. He told me once that the worst part of the entire ordeal wasn't the physical suffering or even the betrayal by his daughter, but the moments of clarity when he had known something was wrong with him, but had been too confused and weak to help himself, the helpless terror of feeling his mind and body failing and not understanding why. Those conversations deepened my understanding of how precious and fragile life is, how the people we trust with our care wield incredible power, and how important it is to speak up when something doesn't feel right, even when it's scary, even when it's risky. Marcus passed away 3 years after the trial at the age of 76, but this time it was genuinely from natural causes. A peaceful death in his sleep after a day spent working in his garden and having dinner with friends. I was there, and as heartbreaking as it was to lose him, there was also something beautiful about it. Something right. He had gotten those extra years, had died with dignity and surrounded by people who genuinely loved him, rather than being buried alive by those who saw him only as an obstacle to wealth. At his real funeral, a small, intimate service in a Vermont chapel with maybe 30 people who had actually known and cared for him, I gave the eulogy and I talked about courage, not just my courage in speaking up, but Marcus's courage in choosing to forgive, to move forward, to make meaning from suffering. I shared how he had used his experience to help establish stronger protections for elderly people in care situations, how his foundation had already helped expose and prevent numerous cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation. His legacy wasn't the business empire he had built. It was the lives he had touched and protected through his second chance at life. Looking back now, 5 years after that November morning when I stopped a funeral and changed the course of multiple lives, I'm struck by how much has changed and how much I've learned. I think about the person I was when I first walked through those iron gates, desperate, struggling, just trying to survive. I think about the moment I heard that heartbeat and had to choose between safety and speaking up, between self-preservation and doing what was right even when the odds were stacked against me. That choice didn't just save Marcus's life, it fundamentally changed who I am. I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust your instincts, even when everyone around you thinks you're wrong, even when the rational part of your brain is screaming at you to stay quiet and protect yourself. I learned that evil often hides behind respectability and expensive suits, that the people we trust the most can sometimes be the most dangerous, and that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing makes us complicit in that wrongdoing. But I also learned about the incredible power of human resilience, about second chances, and about how one person speaking up, even someone without power or influence or resources, can change everything. I've since used the reward money that Marcus insisted on giving me to go back to school and get a degree in social work, specializing in elder care advocacy. I work with families to recognize signs of abuse, with care facilities to implement better safeguards, and with elderly individuals to ensure they have people in their lives who truly care about their well-being and not just their bank accounts. Every single day, I carry the lesson of that experience with me, that speaking up matters, that one voice can make a difference, that sometimes the most ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things. I won't lie and say the experience didn't leave scars. I still sometimes wake up from nightmares about that casket, about what would have happened if I had stayed silent, about the sound of that heartbeat that no one else could hear. I went through months of therapy to process the trauma of it all, the weight of holding someone's life in my hands, the fear I felt throughout the trial when Victoria's legal team tried to destroy my credibility and reputation. But those scars remind me of why this work is so important, why we can't afford to look away when we suspect something is wrong, why we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, to be questioned, to be doubted, if it means protecting someone who can't protect themselves. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this: trust yourself. If you see something that doesn't feel right, if you hear something that sets off alarm bells in your gut, if you witness something that makes you uncomfortable even if you can't quite articulate why, don't ignore it. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't let fear of being wrong or fear of consequences stop you from speaking up. Yes, there are risks. I could have lost my job, my reputation, even faced legal consequences if I had been wrong about Marcus. But the risk of staying silent when someone's life is in danger is infinitely greater. We live in a world that often rewards people for minding their own business, for not making waves, for staying in their lane, but some situations demand that we step outside our comfort zones and become advocates for those who can't advocate for themselves. Whether it's an elderly family member whose caregiver seems suspicious, a child who seems afraid around a particular adult, a coworker who you suspect is being abused, or any situation where someone vulnerable might be in danger, your voice matters. Your observations matter. Your willingness to ask uncomfortable questions and push for answers might be the only thing standing between someone and tragedy. I also want you to understand that this isn't just about dramatic life or death situations like what I experienced. It's about the everyday moments when we choose between comfort and courage, between self-interest and doing what's right. It's about the small choices we make to either speak up or stay silent, to either investigate our concerns or dismiss them, to either trust our instincts or talk ourselves out of them. Every single one of those choices shapes who we are and what kind of world we create together. Marcus used to tell me during our conversations in Vermont that he had lived a long life filled with accomplishments, but the thing he was most grateful for in the end was that someone cared enough to look closer, to listen harder, to trust their gut when everything seemed normal on the surface. He said that my willingness to risk everything for someone who was basically a stranger to me had restored his faith in humanity after his own daughter had betrayed him so completely. Those words stay with me, fuel me on the hard days when this work feels overwhelming, remind me why speaking up will always be worth it. So I'm asking you now, have you ever been in a situation where you suspected something was wrong but stayed silent? Have you ever ignored your instincts because speaking up seemed too risky or too complicated? Have you ever witnessed something concerning and talked yourself out of taking action? I want you to share your experiences in the comments below, not to judge or criticize, but to start a conversation about how we can all be better at recognizing when someone needs help and having the courage to provide it. Maybe you've been the person who spoke up and saved someone, or maybe you're the person who wishes you had spoken up when you had the chance. Maybe you've been on the receiving end, someone who needed help and was grateful when someone noticed and cared enough to act. All of these stories matter. All of these experiences contribute to our collective understanding of how important it is to look out for each other, especially for the most vulnerable among us. Please take a moment right now to comment and share your thoughts, your experiences, your questions. This conversation is too important to keep silent about, and your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to speak up in their own situation. And if this story has resonated with you, if it's made you think differently about the importance of trusting your instincts and speaking up when something feels wrong, I want to ask you to do a few things for me. First, please hit that like button right now. It helps this story reach more people, and the more people who hear this message about the importance of advocacy and speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves, the better. Second, if you haven't already subscribed to I Live to Tell, please do that right now and make sure you hit that notification bell. I share true stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and found the courage to do the right thing even when it was terrifying. Stories that remind us of our own capacity for bravery and our responsibility to each other. These aren't just stories for entertainment. They're lessons about humanity, about courage, about the choices that define who we are. Third, share this video with someone in your life who needs to hear it, whether that's someone who works with vulnerable populations, someone who has elderly family members in care situations, or just someone who needs a reminder that their voice and their observations matter. The algorithms favor videos that get shared, so by sharing this story, you're not just helping this channel grow, you're spreading a message that could literally save lives. And finally, I want you to commit right now to trusting your instincts. The next time you see something that doesn't feel right, the next time you hear something that sets off alarm bells, the next time you're in a position to speak up for someone who can't speak for themselves, I want you to remember Marcus Reynolds and remember that your willingness to risk being wrong, to risk being uncomfortable, to risk the consequences of speaking up might be the only thing standing between someone and disaster. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being the kind of person who wants to make a difference in this world. I'll see you in the next story, and remember, your voice matters, your instincts matter, and you have more power than you think to change someone's life for the better.